I'm Jean Seaton from the Orwell Foundation, and we're really delighted tonight to have two speakers and to begin to try and have a discussion about one of the many crises that are facing the country, which is really the housing crisis. That's sort of one of those, one of Beveridge's 5 wants, one of those 5 great evils. And here we are back in 2023, facing a fairly evil, actually, not just bad housing, but a fairly evil set of conditions, actually, genuinely malign, in a way that I think hasn't been the case, at least deliberately, for some time. So we're absolutely delighted to have Vicky Spratt, who's just wonderful from the eye. She's done nothing but write about housing for a long time. Her wonderful book, Tenants, the people on the front line of Britain's housing emergency, which you can buy as you go out, is shortlisted for our new Homelessness Prize. I mean, it's a really fantastic book that has lots of analysis. Actually, she was interestingly saying in the green room that she had to teach herself economics, but if I may say so, you wear it lightly. Keynes would be proud of you. In order to understand some of the things that are going on, and which we're all in the gut of this crisis. Peter Apps, Show Me the Bodies, from Inside Housing, Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen. And these are 2 intersecting books, really, about an intersecting set of crises that are unfolding. So we're very pleased to have you here tonight. And I just really wanted, and these are 2 also, they're actually on a double act, you didn't know that. They're going to do a comedy stand-up somewhere quite soon. They're going to Edinburgh. They've done one before, because in a way they also represent, in a way that journalism can do sometimes, the way in which a set of crises accumulate a set of reporters, and that goes up both the journalistic, which is what we live to try and change, the sort of journalistic agenda, but also their work makes us more, and we hope policymakers, more sensible, sensitive to things. So thank you very, very much, both of you. I just wanted you to both very briefly tell us what's the kind of crisis that your book crunches. It's in a way, it's obvious with Grenfell, it's slightly less obvious with this, with Tenants. What's the crisis that your books investigate, crunch, and how did we get to that crisis? So Vicky, I mean, they're both actually very interestingly, they both come out of the same time frame. So how did we get to here?
Well, Tenants focuses on the private rented sector in particular, but you can't talk about that without talking about home ownership and social housing. And it talks a little bit about Grenfell, but not in depth. And it really, I think, is the story of everything that has happened to housing in this country since the 1980s. One particular jumping off point is the 1988 Housing Act, which was brought in during Margaret Thatcher's time in government, which got rid of renters' rights, among other things, and really set the tone for the crisis we're now in, where you have no protections for renters, and of course that came after Right to Buy had been introduced, mass sell-off of social housing, probably one of the greatest acts of privatisation in this country ever. And those 2 things have then got us to where we are now, which is more low-income people relying on private landlords who are largely unregulated than living in social housing, where they are somewhat protected and looked after. And that, I think, is probably one of the most urgent problems we face as a country, because with rents going up and inflation, people can't afford those privately rented homes. And our government, in their wisdom, have frozen the local housing allowance, which is how housing benefit is calculated, at 2019-2020 levels. But rents have hit historic highs since then. So Tenants stopped before the inflation crisis really got as bad as it is. But I think it traces back to the early 80s and then the 1988 Housing Act, and looks at how deliberate policy decisions unravelled the welfare safety net and created the conditions where any disaster, be it a pandemic or global inflation, would just knock over a very flimsy house of cards, which is what's happened.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Yeah, it is interesting how much overlap there is between the two timelines. Obviously, my book is about the Grenfell Tower fire, and sort of half about what happened on the night, and half about the series of decisions that led us to that point. And similarly to Vicky, particularly the kind of political story starts in the 1980s with a specific piece of legislation and with a specific decision and a specific philosophy, which was, in this instance, the belief that the way to grow the housing market was to deregulate, well, grow the construction industry was to deregulate house builders, stop the bureaucrats in Westminster telling them what to do and let them make their own decisions about how to build homes safely. So we got rid overnight of, I think it's listed as about 300 pages of regulation, replaced with 24 headline standards. And so these kind of rules that had grown up over a long period of time, going right back to the Great Fire of London, were just kind of swept into the bin overnight. And since then, you've seen the construction industry become more powerful and less accountable, because the rules that govern it are quite loose, and the enforcement of those rules is almost non-existent. And so the result of that in an industry which operates on quite low margins and chases profit is that corners get cut, safety becomes an afterthought, and you end up with lots of dangerous buildings. And that's the position that we've allowed to develop. It's kind of inevitable if you do that sooner or later one of those buildings is going to be so dangerous that it creates a disaster. And so that event, which is 6 years ago on Wednesday actually, was the culmination of that philosophy and those decisions to allow that industry to kind of run rogue, really.
This is a slightly provocative question. You know, the 1988 Housing Act and some of those decisions were also in their turn a response to something that had gone wrong in housing. So it wasn't as if housing was perfect. Social housing was perfect in 1988, and if you look at, you know, Manchester, lots of big buildings weren't operating. Can we just go back just a little bit? So you know, there wasn't a perfect moment when regulation and social housing was working, or was there?
No, I don't think so, really. I mean, yeah, we've only, like, if you're talking about Grenfell, you're building high-rise houses is something that we've only really done since the 1950s and 60s. And the first high-rise disaster in this country was in the mid-1960s. Yes. So it wasn't long after. I mean, you know, that's the first generation, really, of high-rise housing. But then if you go even further back than that, you know, there were housing standards have always developed in this country slowly and with great resistance following disasters. It's only after, and it's partly the reason for the title of my book, but it's only after people die that there is ever enough pressure to impose the next standard. And so, I mean, I'll let Vicky talk about the 1988 Housing Act, but rent controls come from people being under pressure and being unable to pay their rent. I think Vicky will know this better than me, but I think in the sort of the First World War period, and the country couldn't sustain that level of dissent at that time, and so it was possible to bring these in. But all of the sort of small wins in terms of housing standards, whether it's regulating the construction industry or regulating rents, tend to come from people suffering and then pushing back. But in the 80s, that's all of those things were ripped away, or lots of them were.
I think the deregulation that happened with private renting in particular, but of course social housing was changed in the 80s and creation of housing associations, taking house building away from local councils. There was a lot of change. But the argument that was made by Margaret Thatcher's government, sorry, I'm laughing because it's just so absurd, but they said that if we deregulated private renting and made it easier for people to become landlords, then there would be better quality homes. Like, sure. It hasn't worked. We have loads of really, really bad quality privately rented homes. But we had slums at that time. We did have lots of really, really poor quality homes, but they thought the problem was regulation, the problem was rent control. So they just got rid of all of what they saw as red tape, what you might argue is not red tape, but important legislation to make sure nobody gets sick and dies. And it made things even worse. And then social housing standards have really, really, really slipped. Mould, damp, I've seen ceilings falling down. I mean, privately rented homes, I've seen that too. Conditions in this country that belong in the Victorian era but exist all around the country. And it was sold as a sort of a revolution of deregulation that would make things better, because if you create a competitive market, whether that was in social housing or private renting, then all of the housing providers would want to be the best, because of course that's what they care about, not making money. But I think similarly with Grenfell, Grenfell was such a turning point in terms of the way people spoke about social housing and the people who live in it, and it was a real wake-up call, I think, for the Conservative Party, who had previously voted down legislation that was then to make homes fit for human habitation, that was then voted in after the fire. But we had something similar even at the end of last year, when the inquest into the death of a 2-year-old boy who died in social housing in Rochdale because he was exposed to mould and damp, confirmed that is what had killed him. And suddenly everyone was like, oh, we can't have this in this country. But it seems to take something really terrible happening for housing to be taken seriously. And I can't think of another, for want of a better word, market where that would be allowed.
Well, so I just want to pick, because there have been cycles of, the first generation of council housing, particularly in places like Sheffield, was put up, but in fact there were cost cutting, so that it degenerated very quickly. So what had been a miracle, Sheffield, Manchester, what had been seen as miracles of social housing, had in fact decayed very quickly and became, pretty problematic. So we've been through various kind of quite uncomfortable cycles, actually, of leaving things. I mean, anyway, that's a sort of.
No, it's an important point. I mean, I'm interested to know what Pete thinks, but there are some really, really terrible blocks. And there are some really, really good estates that I visited of homes that were built and are good quality, like Withenshaw in Manchester springs to mind. That's really, I think, pretty well designed. But there are obviously lots of really bad examples too.
I think, there's been several eras of social housing, and it's a funny thing because there's always some sort of philosophy that is trying to be imposed. Either you're talking about, people get these ideas about streets in the sky, which is quite famous, and we get all of the brutalism and the high rises, and like Vicky says, some of those estates work and some of them don't. Some of them work for a little while and then external economic factors change and they stop working. But you constantly in the social housing is kind of marked by these ideas of kind of middle class town planners sort of thinking this is how poor people should live, and saying actually all of the homes need to open, instead of opening onto the street, they all need to open onto a kind of green area. And so that's why you see, even sort of outside of cities, but you see these kind of low density housing estates when you go off out into Essex, where they're all based around greens, and that's because of there's a particular type of thinking that dominates that period of building social housing. But what you consistently throughout all of these times, people move into those homes, and so long as they're well managed and so long as the rents are kept affordable, these communities work, because that's all people needed really, was a roof over their heads, a place to raise their families, and rents that didn't crush them.
Undermanaged.
And at all times where they've had that, we're kind of, in spite more of the various philosophies that have kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the last 150 years, or however long it's we've been building council housing of one kind or another, so long as people have been given the basic, decent standard of housing, the communities have thrived. And when they haven't, they haven't.
And management. If there was, looking back, which again is, if there were one or two points that you could have stopped the catastrophe that's unfolded, do you mean policies? What would have? I mean, you've got a very clear catastrophe. And you've got a sort of, as it were, hidden, unrolling catastrophe in a way. You've got a pandemic. He's got a brutal escape. If you're looking back, what might you have done?
I think that, I mean, one of the really, really tragic things with the Grenfell Tower fire, and this is something that came up so much in the inquiry, is there's so many, in answer to that question, there's so many opportunities. I mean, just to pull a couple out of thin air, and they're very specific as well. In 1991, you had a fire in Knowsley Heights in Merseyside, which was at a block which was actually being monitored. It was a £1 million Treasury-funded project to see whether or not overcladding high-rises was a good idea or not. And within the first few weeks of that project, there was a fire which spread. It started in the bins outside and spread from the base of the tower to the 11th floor within the 10 minutes that it took the firefighters to arrive. And at that point, you could have just gone, well, if we use plastic and it's combustible, this is creating the situation for a catastrophe. But instead, there's an internal government memo which says the consequences of the fire will be played down. And they said, we don't want it to have implications for other schemes which are currently coming through the thing. And at that point, in 1991, you could say, if they had just said, well, combustible materials in cladding systems are a bad idea, you stop this train in its tracks. And that happens again in 1999 with the Parliamentary Select Committee, which says all cladding systems should be non-combustible and all social landlords should be reviewing them as part of their risk assessment. At that point, the country only had 500. By the time we got to Grenfell, we had closer to 10,000. At that point, again, you stop the train in its tracks. In 2001, the government runs a test on the exact type of cladding that is later used on Grenfell Tower. It's a 30-minute test. They have to stop it after 9 minutes because the flames are reaching 9 metres above the rig. They stopped it for the safety of those present. A report went to officials which said, if you don't raise standards, this stuff is going to be used on people's homes. But nothing was done. And then you had Lakanal House in 2009 where 6 people died and the coroner said there should be a review of external, a review of building regulations with particular regard to external fire spreads. Not done. And then in 2014, you had, again, internal warnings, and in 2015 and 2016, emails literally going to government saying you could have a fire like the ones you're seeing in Dubai tomorrow in London, from people who were literally selling these products and building these buildings. And so you could pick any one of those, and I've probably listed about 10% of the opportunities that you could have, where you, with no exaggeration whatsoever, you could say if people just had the will to make a difficult decision, or not even that difficult a decision, to just make an honest decision, then this whole process stops in its tracks. And that is one of the most extraordinary things I was constantly shocked by throughout the inquiry, the sort of just, normally you would think 1 or 2 opportunities to stop something like this is enough, but with this there's dozens.
It just makes my blood run cold, hearing it. Every time you say it, it still makes me so angry. I think similarly, there have been so many opportunities that different politicians could have taken to stop what was a housing crisis, and it is now an emergency that I think is going to see lots and lots and lots of people be made homeless. There were so many opportunities. Like when they brought in Right to Buy, they could have said, okay, well, we need to replace the homes that we're selling off, otherwise we're going to have a problem. They didn't do that. Then in the 90s, no politician on the left or the right really looked at that seriously, even though the private rented sector was growing. With house prices too, I find it quite chilling that house price inflation was seen as a good thing, even after the 2008 global financial crisis. We had a crash and lots of people ended up in negative equity in this country, not just in America. And I've interviewed people who are still paying off those debts. And yet we celebrated the return of house price inflation like it was a good thing. And then in the pandemic, before that, George Osborne and David Cameron introduced Help to Buy, which was a deliberate and I think quite craven attempt to prop up house building and keep the housing market moving after the crisis, even though that maybe was not what was actually needed. You could have looked at ways of making housing genuinely affordable. You could have invested in building social housing. But George Osborne famously said, I think it was Nick Clegg who was quoted as relaying him saying this, well, council housing just creates Labour voters, so let's create homeowners. Like it was very, very, very deliberate. And now we're in a situation where during the pandemic, the decision was taken to cut stamp duty, to inflate house prices, because that gives the illusion of economic growth at a time when the economy is in trouble. And I think we're really on a cliff edge now. We're about to find out what happens if you do that and wages don't keep pace with that house price inflation and interest rates rise because of external economic factors, and we're not prepared. And there are so many moments, Grenfell being one of them in a slightly different way with conditions, but with affordability there are so many moments. And it could have been a key issue at any point in the last 10 years. I think the writing has been on the wall probably since about 2012 with house prices, and nobody's wanted to touch it. Although Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party did actually have in their manifesto a proposal to bring in house price inflation targets, which would have been wildly unpopular, potentially unworkable, unless you really moved some big obstacles, but actually a very good idea and probably what's needed. I think moving forwards we might actually see something like that, because lots of people are going to be unable to pay their mortgages in months
and run
to
into
come.
negative equity.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the Fannie Mae British moment, as it were, repeated.
And private renters can't pay their rents, and benefits, as I said earlier, don't cover them. So it's this real web of catastrophes that have been clearly coming for quite some time.
So this is a sort of unusual question. Who was most culpable? I mean, we live in it. These are structural issues. There are lots of people caught in structures, including the victims, but there are people making decisions. So, Peter, who was? You know, there's a big inquiry going on. Who was responsible for Grenfell?
It's a tricky question to answer for a few reasons, but I think if you break it down, the Grenfell Tower fire was possible because there was cladding on the walls, which had an internal core of plastic, which was chemically the same as petrol. And that cladding was sold by a large American company called Arconic, who had testing from 2004 onwards, which showed how it would perform in a fire. And continually, internally, made the decision to keep selling it. Even in the face of their marketing manager in 2008 writing a briefing which said we need to consider what we do if a fire involving our product kills 60 to 70 people. So there's lots of people who are, and that cladding the view of the inquiry is that cladding is the primary cause of the external fire spread. There are lots of people you could point to who are to blame for other parts of this, all of which are really significant. There was endemic maintenance issues with Grenfell. The fire door self-closers were broken. The local authority, landlord of the block, had made a pretty active decision not to fix them because it didn't want to spend that money, despite being able to find money to spend on an enormous amount of other things. There are obviously government decisions, which I talked about answering your last question, but very few of those people actually had a line of sight on a disaster, killing dozens of people. The company which sold the cladding did, documented that, and sold it anyway. And so if you're going to start writing a list of who's more culpable than who, I personally would put them at the top. And, you know, we will see how the inquiry makes its mind up. Arconic, you know, just in case their lawyers are watching, argue that's not true at all, and they sold a product which then architects could have specified in a safe configuration and chose not to, and so they blame the architects, and they blame building control, and they blame the UK government for not tightening regulations enough to ban it from the market. And, you know, all of those arguments are valid, but it doesn't change the fact that they knew something was dangerous and they sold it. And that, in the end, if you take the hugely complicated web of failure which led us to Grenfell down to its most simple point, you have one company selling a dangerous product for profit in the knowledge that it's dangerous, and that's the whole story.
I mean,
is that because it's quite interesting, because I think both the books do have individuals making decisions on the night, you know, individuals making decisions, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes informed, tragic, you know, and people feel different degrees of culpability. And one of the things about where we are, as it were, politically at the moment, it seems ramifying that individuals take responsibility for things seems to me a quite interesting alternative view of how you might run a society.
I've enjoyed Matt Hancock arguing that his behaviour is not of interest to the public.
Yes.
I think there's a very interesting attitude amongst some of our politicians. They think that their behaviour is somehow not in the public interest or not our business when they're making decisions about how we're allowed to behave. But we're not here to talk about him. I think you could go back to Thatcher, you could go back to the 80s, you could point to various things in the 90s, the introduction of buy-to-let mortgages, for instance, lots of different people involved in that. But I would say the conditions of the housing market that we are now going to have to clean up have been very specific since 2008. And I think that the Cameron Osborne years were probably a moment where several things could have happened and didn't happen. They completely ignored private renting, didn't want to know about it, didn't want to know about the conditions, didn't want to know about costs. And that really allowed things to get completely out of control. They didn't want to build social housing, as I mentioned earlier, so that pushed more low-income renters into private renting. And then they, to quote a right-wing think tank, poured petrol on the bonfire of house prices with Help to Buy knowingly. And in some ways it was a successful policy because they wanted to inflate the housing market and they wanted developers to make money, and that's exactly what happened. You had the chief executive of Persimmon having to resign after receiving huge bonuses because of the scheme. So in some ways a very successful policy, but I think it was one that the government deliberately chose to turn towards business and profit and away from the role of the state in providing secure and affordable housing. And I actually interviewed one of George Osborne's advisors who was an architect of the Help to Buy scheme. I told him that I'd used Help to Buy a flat. My Help to Buy loan, I need to check, but it's over £200,000. It's a significant debt that I have. And then this guy who's now at a hedge fund said to me, "Oh, but surely you're just going to pay it off." I was like, if I had that much money, do you think I would have used a government affordability scheme to buy a house? So I think that government, for me, particularly egregious because they didn't understand most people's reality, because they were so privileged and wealthy that they designed a scheme without really thinking, well, why is someone using this scheme? Could they ever pay it back? I think Help to Buy will probably become one of the big scandals of the next few years. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we? I think it's unravelling.
But both of you are stories about the destruction of regulation as well. I mean, the deliberate, and you see it in other areas, you know, this is a very common story of the last 10 years. I mean, it's called Bonfire of the Red Tape, but it was actually the removal of either the capacity to punish or indeed the capacity to understand what was happening of regulators. Are regulators, what would you do about regulators?
I think it's...
I really love regulation.
Yeah, well, I mean, you write about Grenfell for 6 years and you end up sharing that view, certainly. I mean, I think, like, regulation is more than just having a rule.
Yeah.
And the attack on regulation is more than just taking rules away, although that is the first part of it. Because you need to enforce rules. And so the second way in which regulations are undermined is that the bodies which should enforce the rules are weakened. Very, very often in housing that means local authorities.
Yes.
It does for building and construction because that's the building control team, and then with the the new renters reforms that are coming in, that's supposedly going to be like the 2 environmental health officers in the London Borough inspecting all of the nearly 100,000 private rented homes in that area. And then the third bit of it, which has kind of come out in the Grenfell inquiry, and I write quite a lot about in my book, is the capture of bodies which then kind of have the power to set the rules and set standards by industry. So you have an organisation like the British Board of Agreement, which provides certificates saying this construction product does what it says on the tin. Basically, it will withstand certain wind strengths. It's structurally stable and it's not combustible. But what you see from the inquiry is behind the scenes, that is effectively a private organisation which is selling a certificate to the product manufacturer. They have an inappropriately close relationship and they do not scrutinise what's being said because they don't want to wind their clients up. And that is repeated. The National House Building Council, which these strange bodies end up getting powers effectively to write the rules in the absence of proper government regulation, and then they get taken over by industry. And so industry writes its own rules, it marks its own homework, it sets its own standards, and you have these obscure kind of bodies which meet, and everybody there is bought and paid for, essentially, by some interest group. And that is how, and as someone, I remember someone said to me that that's okay when you're kind of working out what standards of waterproof we need to have on a raincoat, and these product manufacturers are just going to gain a small advantage for themselves, and maybe you're going to get a bit ripped off when you buy your next raincoat, but nobody dies. But when you're talking about the combustibility and the toxicity of the smoke that's going to come out of your sofa when it catches fire, it's suddenly a lot more serious. And that's what's happened. I was encouraged by the website Labour List recently got a sort of leak of all of these Labour policies that may or may not get into the next manifesto, and very small lines in there about exploring nationalisations of smaller kind of fish. Maybe we're not going to kind of do a full-on renationalisation of water, which would be nice, but if you renationalise the NHBC and the BBA and the British Standards Institution, all of these organisations which no one on the street has ever heard about but actually has an enormous influence over their lives, then you maybe start building up a system which can work again. So yeah, I'd nationalise all these bodies. I'd clean out the inappropriate relationships and the commercial relationships they have with industry. Yeah, and then I'd set tough rules. And when industry complained about it, I'd say, well, innovate. That's what innovation is. After we banned cladding in this country, which is actually the first bit of prescriptive, ban combustible cladding, something the Grenfell survivors and bereaved lobbied for, it was the first piece of prescriptive building regulation since Thatcher. It took 2 years after Grenfell to get to that point, and the government resisted it at every stage. But after it was done, you suddenly saw new non-combustible products hitting the market within months that were great, that companies hadn't developed before. Like, regulation creates ideas. People go, okay, so we have to do something that doesn't burn, so we're going to figure that problem out. And actually, then suddenly the market starts working if it's regulated. It's when you deregulate it that they go, actually, well, we don't need to innovate, we don't need to think of anything, we'll just sell the cheapest crap and make a huge profit. And so it's kind of like, it's like what Vicky was saying earlier, in that you're trying to achieve this aim that you actually undermine by getting rid of by just giving industry what it wants, which isn't a brilliant end product, it's profit, and profit tomorrow.
I think there's something really interesting going on with private renting reform at the moment that speaks to what Pete's talking about. So this renters reform bill that was first promised by Theresa May, that will come in hopefully at some point and give renters some of the rights that were taken away in the 80s. If it goes well, it will create a functional market where there are rules and landlords have to behave, rather than the dysfunctional market that we've got where there are very, very few rules and nobody behaves and people are paying through the nose.
People are farmed.
Yeah.
People are farmed.
And exploited. But one of the really interesting proposals is that renters will be able to have rolling tenancies that they can end with 2 months' notice whenever they want. Now that to me sounds like a free market. Sounds pretty fair. Sounds like people can do whatever they want. But the landlord lobby are now arguing against that and saying that they need more regulation to make sure that they know when their tenancies are going to be ended. And I find that fascinating, because I suppose what you think of regulation really depends on where your interests lie. And I've been laughing along at them as they're trying to convince the government to not make it easier for people to leave their homes, to make it harder. It's wild, but it's almost like a double think from the landlord lobby.
So both of you, this is the last thing, and then I'll open it up. The thing's called the future of housing. In a way, I can see there are some very clear proposals on the table. Regulate, or at least make the regulators, give the regulators teeth and set them and make them more independent. We are actually facing a kind of, a sort of potential catastrophe. You have to be as old as me to know what happens when interest rates and mortgages go where they're going. It's really, really terrifying. Really terrifying. Are there any opportunities in this particular catastrophe that really is it's really, I think, going to unfold over the next year and a half?
I think there are.
As Labour comes in, it's an absolute nightmare.
Well, plenty of opportunities, but will they be taken is the question. So there have been opportunities over the last decade to completely rejig the housing market, and it's not happened. I think what's coming is really, really scary. And I've been in eviction courts, sitting in on private rental evictions and also home repossessions. And the courts are currently running behind because of the pandemic. So what I'm seeing is maybe, 6 months out of date, and it's pretty scary. So I think it really depends on whether Labour win and how far they're prepared to go. But I am concerned by the government we've got right now, because really important things like leasehold reform are being watered down, turned into a non-existent move, really, making it very, very tokenistic. And I know that's freeholders who have lots and lots of money and are mostly offshore funds getting meetings with the right people and lobbying. So I'm not incredibly confident in the current administration. I really, really worry that Rishi Sunak, in particular, for some reason he doesn't understand the economics of housing. Because if you did, you would increase housing benefit yesterday, and you would be doing something about mortgage interest. Maybe they will, but you wouldn't be talking about help. But you wouldn't be talking about Help to Buy 2.0 to inflate things further, because the relationship between what people earn and how much homes can be bought and sold for is elastic, and it's been stretched to the point of breaking. But I suppose it would be great if this wasn't the case, but when disasters do happen, things change. So I'm hopeful, and I think I say this a lot at the end of tenants, I'm hopeful that things are now so bad that something has to give. And what will give will probably be people who are overstretched and bought homes at the top of the market, and it will be low-income renters who are now living in temporary accommodation. I think the number of those people who've been made homeless will swell. But then I think we will probably have to return to the state providing affordable housing, not just for people on low incomes who are really struggling, but for communities and people who we might consider to be middle class. I mean, social housing wasn't just limited to people on low incomes at first, and that's something my grandparents always really drilled into me. I mean, they were low income when they were given their first council flat, but they were surrounded by other people who had what they would call good jobs. And now we're at a point where if you have a quote unquote good job, you still can't afford a home. So something will have to happen, and I think the state will have to intervene, which is great, but it should never have got to this.
Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Vicky said there. I'm particularly like this. What is happening now is going. The next few years are going to look very different to the decade that's gone behind us. The whole model was staked on basically the Treasury closing their eyes and hoping that interest rates would never rise. And that's our whole economic model in terms of housing, and housing is so central to the British economy. Interest rates have now risen, and it's almost like, the wave hasn't hit yet, but it's there and it's coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it hitting. But the question is then what happens as a result of that? And the immediate impact is people suffer, and there's no getting around that. But then what happens next is a lot of these things, like Vicky says, open opportunities. If a developer has built a 30-storey tower in Zone 3 near a tube station, which they were hoping to sell one-bedroom apartments at 500,000, the penthouse for 2.5 million, and now that's not going to happen. What do you do with that structure? Do you just leave it empty? Or maybe does the state come in and say, well, actually, we're going to do a distressed asset purchase and turn it into social housing? And that can happen, and has happened, and does happen around the world. What do you do when private landlords start leaving the market and saying, well, we don't like this idea of regulation, we don't like rent control, actually our mortgage rates have gone up and buy-to-let mortgage, so I stuff it, I don't want to do it anymore. The Scottish Government already is looking at ways that social housing providers could buy those properties and put them back onto the market as social rented houses. You buy them tenanted even. So the tenant never even needs to leave. They just switch from being a private tenant to being a tenant of the council.
And that's happening in London.
Yeah, that is happening in London with right to buy homes being bought back. All of these things do create opportunities for this dominant form of housing policy which has governed since the 1980s without being disrupted to go. It has to go now because it can only survive a low interest rate world. So that means there is an opportunity for what follows. I think like a lot of the questions about the world at the moment feel like we kind of could go one of two ways. We could go, you look at things like the climate crisis, all of these things that are going to define the next couple of decades. We have a kind of apocalyptic pathway and one where actually things get remarkably better. And I really have no idea which way housing is going to go, but either of them feel possible. And 5 or 6 years ago, that alternative pathway where things got better didn't even feel possible. So I'm sort of vaguely optimistic with a slight sense of, but this could and probably will still go completely pear-shaped.
I mean, if it takes the apocalyptic route, it will be so disastrous. And I don't know if that will be allowed to happen. I mean, it can't get much worse than it is, right? I
think you saw that in a weird way during the pandemic, in that there is a threshold where the government starts to act. They say for quite a long time, no, actually, we're just going to say that your 70-year-old mum is going to have to die at home because there's not going to be a ventilator for her, because we're not going to disrupt the economy. This has to be, we take it on the chin, or whatever it was Boris Johnson said at the start. But then that actually starts happening and the ambulances start queuing up. And I don't think every decision made in the pandemic was a good one, but there comes a point where they go, no, the British state cannot survive this. We must act. And then that kind of cuts across political philosophies which have said, oh no, of course you can't raise local housing allowance because the Daily Mail will shout at you for it. But when you go, oh actually, but we're going to see tens of thousands of people made homeless, suddenly what's politically acceptable completely changes.
And I think that's the key here, is really whoever wins the next election, if they don't act, they will be the party that saw thousands and thousands of people made homeless by rising mortgage rates and by rising private rents and by the lack of social housing. And I think where our books do intersect as well is like this period of experimentation with free markets and deregulation. And I think we are now watching the experiment fail because as Pete said, it could only survive a low interest rate world. And it couldn't survive a pandemic, and it can't survive a war in Ukraine, and whoever else knows what is going to happen, because we live on a planet in the middle of space, and shock, we're not in control of things that happen. And I think that's what's being tested now. And politicians ultimately will go where public opinion goes, because they have a vested interest in being elected. And what do you do if people can't afford homes? Eventually people will start protesting. So I think something will give, but I could also be wrong.
Yeah.
on which cheery or pessimistic note, we'll take some questions. What I'd like to do is take 2 or 3 questions in a go, just to get people. So 1, 2, 3. If you could just, put a question, 1, 2, 3, I'll come back to you for the next round.
Sorry, hello, my question is the concept of building is the way forward, but yet construction is quite expensive. And so in a way it's how does it get paid, but also how do the rents stay low, because the kind of social rents of a built building doesn't really pay even the interest if say a council has to borrow. So it's just that I do like the idea of buying back existing buildings, but if you look at building and also where, sorry, 2 questions there, but kind of where and how would the model work now that construction is also faced by interest, lack of resources, the whole cost going up? How do people look at that happening? And numbers as well would be great.
Thank you very much. So how could you make that policy work?
Thanks. So my question is about regulation. We've talked a lot about how there's been sort of bonfires of red tape and regulation has been stripped away. Do you have any thoughts about how that can be prevented? Because we see it happen cyclically, that a government will put regulation in, another government 20 years later will strip it out. So is there any way that you can make regulation hold for longer periods of time?
Right at the back. Yeah. Very much this side. So,
I'm curious to know if you know if the Labour Party at the moment, if there are any signs that they would want to prioritise housing if they get elected. I haven't really been following this, so do you have any?
thank you very much.
Any hopeful signs of that?
How would you make a policy work, really? How do you get the rabbit out of the hat? And how do you make regulation work? Though you sort of answered one version of that a bit. And does the Labour Party have a policy?
Shall I
Go
go
for
first?
it.
I'm interested to hear your answers.
So, yeah, I mean, on the first question, obviously, it was a lot easier to make it all stack up when interest rates were lower, and that's true of building social housing as well as inflating the housing market with Help to Buy. I think over a prolonged period of time, social housing pays for itself. It reduces the amount that the government spends on housing benefit. It is revenue generating because people pay a rent for social housing, it's not free. And so I think the Treasury and Treasury officials, and I know Vicky speaks to some occasionally as well, and so do I, have a very dogmatic idea that this just doesn't work and the sums don't add up and you can't make it work without an enormous local government cash, which we don't have and we can't afford. But I think if you kind of change the way that spreadsheet works and you say, well, the government actually makes a gain here over 100 years, then you can justify borrowing that money and investing it in social housing. We borrow enormous amounts to invest in infrastructure all the time, and that's a normal part of our economic activity. I don't really understand why social housing shouldn't be considered in the same way. Second question was, how do you make regulation stick? I don't know. I mean, you know, any law is vulnerable to a new government coming in and wanting to get rid of it. I suppose, apart from what I said before about vested interests and making sure that there are bodies which police this, which aren't just kind of sock puppets of industry, the government didn't want to ban combustible cladding in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. It set up a review of the system which said, actually, you just kind of need forms to be filled out better. I'm being slightly reductive, but it's not a million miles away from the truth. And then there was an enormous, because that thing was exposed, because that wasn't the headline of the government press release, wasn't, we're not going to ban combustible cladding. It was quite a long way down. But because that became the story, ministers were going into interviews and they were saying, well, why do you think we shouldn't ban combustible cladding? It seems a pretty silly idea to me to have this on people's homes given what's happened. And they were so embarrassed that between 9 o'clock of announcing the policy and 1 o'clock of James Brokenshire standing up in the House, they U-turned. And like, deregulation often kind of wears the clothes of common sense, in that people say, they're sort of like, oh, you know, you don't need stupid health and safety rules telling you what to do. Actually, most regulation follows common sense. It's more in people's instinctive belief is the government will ban something dangerous.
Yeah.
And when they hear that the government hasn't banned something dangerous, they say, how the hell wasn't that banned? Not, why hasn't the free market eliminated that through its efficiencies? And so I think that pointing to these things and saying, hey, look, the government's like allowing water companies to dump feces into our most beautiful lakes is the way that these kind of problems, those instances of deregulation don't happen. It's basically people paying attention to the small print and then making a fuss about it is the best answer I can give. What was the third question? I can't remember. I'll let Vicky talk about that. You know more about that than me, probably.
I don't know, do I? No, I suppose maybe. I've spoken to them recently, and they told me that they will, as is always the case, be announcing their policies at party conference. So we'll have to wait. But I think we know a bit about what they're up to. They do want to build social housing. They don't really want to build enough. I think Keir Starmer wants to build on the Greenbelt, but he doesn't seem sure. So maybe we'll get a bit more information about that at conference. They don't want to ban leasehold.
Yeah.
But maybe they'll change their minds on that. And they don't favour rent controls at the moment. Will that become a tenable position? I don't know. Let's see what happens with rents.
Are there any, I mean, one of the horrors is the way in which building has also been let go. I mean, so...
15-year low.
Well, that's good, but also the way in which really bad, not social building has been allowed to sort of splurge everywhere. So do you get any sense of Labour having a William Morris, some sense of building communities and housing that relates to the places it's in? I mean, it's pretty dire in, I know Wales quite well, and really dreadful housing is allowed to,
I think
which doesn't build communities, which could be anywhere.
Michael Gove talks about that more than anyone on the left.
The left needs to find its roots.
They do need to start thinking about building communities. And I think they talk a good game on levelling up, and Lisa Nandy is very passionate about the issue, but I'm not sure that they are coming up with anything that
what
feels...
to do about city centres? I mean, there are a whole set of issues which aren't just more houses. They're about reconfiguring.
I think this actually, Jean, it relates to question one, right? Which is, in a way, I would reject the question because we're still thinking about building homes in a market and that they need to be immediately profitable, that the investment needs a return. But
if I could just add, when you have build social homes, and then you know the distortion of affordable homes, and then it just ends up built homes. And obviously, I live on an estate facing demolition, and I've seen how it happened. Our organisation, our company is set up because of the homeless, and I don't think anyone objects to their home being demolished to build for the homeless, but very soon it's actually in deficit, the number of social homes they're replacing at a higher rent, at an insecure tenancy, and that is just my heartfelt concern. When we're going to build more housing, could just mean anything, and it's very costly too. So I'm on the practical side, even if you did do social.
But this is why it links. I think it links to the levelling up agenda stuff and what Labour are doing and where we're going to build homes. So you have to see housing as essential infrastructure and not expect it to be necessarily profitable at first, because the housing benefit bill, I think, is what, £23.4 billion a year. Now, that if you, as Pete said, change the spreadsheet and think about what we're saving if we actually build homes and they're sustainable and they're good quality and people can afford to live in them over a longer period of time, we'd have a solution.
Any more questions? More questions? Wouldn't this side like to do a question? So one there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if somebody's got your question first, be generous and abandon it. So there's one big, if you could be quite
quick.
Yeah.
Because I've got like 1,000 questions. I guess I'll have 2 questions, and one of them might be a bit mad, but can the state not build property itself rather than employ a builder? That's just a crazy question. And then a slightly less crazy question is, you mentioned regulating interest rates for mortgages if things spiral out of control. And I guess my question is, how does the state do that?
The finger is quite indiscriminate.
There seem to be two questions in the back row there, okay. So I think they both have to be addressed.
My question is about bank regulation. I have been bombarded with very low percentage deposit mortgage advertisements recently. Yeah. NatWest, I think, are doing a 5%. I saw 0%. I was kind of surprised to see that, given what happened in 2008. We obviously have one issue where we're trying to like get the government to regulate on social housing and like dealing with inflation. But I don't know if Keir Starmer's interested in regulating banks or nationalising banks like Iceland did. But what are the implications, or after the crash when one went south, they decided not to bail it out rather. How can these problems be solved when banks continue to go down the same rabbit holes that created the last housing crisis?
My question was about the removal of the Section 21, I can't remember what you called it, the act, the new rental act they're doing. And if you think it's real progress or if it's really just... Because I know there's a lot of loopholes in it where landlords will still be able to evict somehow. I can't remember exactly what they are, but there will still be ways to do no-fault evictions somehow. I wonder if you thought it was actual progress or just a kind of bid to win back some votes for the Tories.
And one last one there. But there's two.
Should we do these three? Because otherwise we'll forget. I'm already forgetting.
Yeah. Okay.
So Vicky, do you want to? Because the banks one's definitely in your swinging zone, and so's the renters reform one.
You want to do, but can the state build?
Yeah. Okay. So that's easy.
Okay. Do you want to start?
Okay. So you were saying, can the state build housing? I mean, that's what council housing is. Council housing is the state. That's the function by which it's done. I mean, they might employ a private bricklayer, but they are the developer of the housing in the same way that Barrett's are the developer of private. Like Barrett's don't lay bricks. They get, John round the corner to do that for them. The state can do that job and does and has, and we've built loads of great housing which people have lived happy lives in as a result. They could do it again. And they make money from doing that as well. It's coming back to the question the lady at the front asked at the start, like over a prolonged period of time, social housing makes a return for the organisation that owns it. That's why lots of banks and lots of institutions invest in it. Yeah. That's why it's become financialised, is because it is profit generating if you're a patient investor. And the state is the ultimate patient investor. So there's no good economic argument why we shouldn't be building more social housing in this country. It's possible, it's been done. It's a political experiment, really, not to. And it's a political experiment which is failing. I think there was a second half to your question, which I think I might have forgotten. But
could the government regulate that? And studies showed that building social housing does boost the economy as well. So it's particularly bonkers that they're not doing it right now, because actually that's like a ready-made solution to the problems we've got post-pandemic.
It's in 2008, 2010 onwards, loads of people who worked in the construction industry were made redundant, and the industry's never recovered from that. Yeah. Because when private house building no longer makes money, they just stop, because every home they build is a loss, and so they press stop. But that means if you're a bricklayer, you've got no work, and if you do utilities connections, you've got no work. The way to keep all of those trades going through a downturn is for the state to step in and build social housing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of like, I'm marginally, because I'm sort of got tunnel vision for social housing because of where I work, I sort of go, well, recession's pretty good actually, because it means there's pressure to invest in social housing. But yeah, so it's completely possible. Was there a bit of your question I haven't answered that quite?
So could the government, did you say regulate interest rates?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So that links to the question that you have at the top. So could the government regulate interest rates? I actually think that would be very, very difficult to do, because the way that mortgage rates are set...
Liz Truss did to regulating interest rates.
Well, right, which was so interesting because it belied a complete lack of understanding of how global financial markets function. She didn't even think that what she was going to do could crash not just our economy, but the sort of the web of how mortgages are traded on international markets. So with swap rates and gilt yields, which is how now we're really getting into it, but like how mortgage rates are set, the state I don't think in this country could step in because that's a global market. What they might do, and I think probably what they should do, although it won't be popular with everyone, is a form of mortgage interest rate relief. And we actually had that, and Gordon Brown got rid of it, so to help people pay the interest on their mortgages. But then you effectively have the state bailing out the banks and the housing market again.
It's what happened with energy bills ultimately, isn't it? They couldn't cap it, so they just paid them.
Exactly. And then I suppose that links to you're being offered 0% and 5% deposit mortgages, which is really scary with where we are, with predictions that there's going to be a housing crash of anywhere between 10 and I'm now hearing 30% in the next year. 20% would take us back to 2020, 30% would take us back. Yeah. Which is really worrying that they're marketing to people who, I'm guessing, they think you're a first-time buyer, maybe you would be. They're saying, hey, buy at the top of the market with next to no equity. But something interesting happened last year that a lot of people missed, which is that they got rid of the stress test on mortgages. So after the 2008 crisis, there was a stress test brought in where people, in order to be approved for a mortgage, you had to be able to pay your mortgage if interest rates went up by a certain multiple. And last year they got rid of that because I think they knew what was coming, which is that nobody would be approved for a mortgage. And I think that bit of deregulation is really, really scary because in order to keep banks lending, they got rid of the protections. So that's why you're being offered 0% deposit mortgages right now, and terrifying.
Thank you very much. Last two questions, I think. Blue stripes and blue. I think that was the last two. Unless there's anybody.
Hi, yeah. So there's probably two parts to this. The first is comes back to that question over financing that was asked. The first question I think we had, and that is sort of like the part of the reason why it doesn't seem to be revenue generating for Treasury is because obviously council housing or housing association homes have essentially been either localised or essentially semi-privatised, so it's off the Treasury's balance books, the revenue that generates. Is there perhaps a need to look at actually proper national, DLUC owning actual housing stock in the future if we're going to get into a model where we accept there's like a long-term revenue stream that government can benefit from? And secondly, linking in with that pricing, the biggest driver and the actual underlying cause of house prices being what they are is essentially the price of the land that they sit on. And part of what drives land prices is obviously the supply of land. So is planning perhaps the missing part of the equation that we've all been discussing and listening to tonight?
I'm part of a housing cooperative just up the road from Grenfell Tower in West 11. And we were set up in the mid-70s as part of special projects, which the then government had created to kind of vary the structures of social housing. Of course, all of that went with Thatcher, and the Labour Party since then hasn't shown much interest. I'm keen on living in a co-op because we control and manage our own homes, but I wonder if you had any comments, what you thought about that.
The first question then, should DLUC own homes? Well, think about it this way. The Homes England, via the Treasury, own the Help to Buy loan book.
Yeah.
So they own a bit of my flat. What's the difference? I'm not sure there is that much of a difference, really. It's just ideological. They own what's effectively a mortgage instead of social housing. But Help to Buy, Right to Buy, I mean, it's just the same idea, but coming from a different economic standpoint. And then I hear this idea about house prices being about the value of land and the scarcity of land being why we've got house price inflation. Increasingly, I'm interrogating that, and I definitely think there was a point when it was true, but now I'm not sure that that's what's driving house price inflation. I think certainly you're right, and there's a lot of land banking that goes on, and land value taxes make sense in some cases where developers are buying land and waiting for it to go up in value. But I think actually what has driven house prices in recent years is political policy, deliberate inflation of the housing market, because mortgages make banks money, which is good for our economy. So I think there's two things going on, which is like land banking and developers wanting to make a profit, and that's definitely been a big barrier to building social homes. But I think there's something else happening with the housing market that means we've seen this historic house price inflation. Maybe your thoughts on those?
I maybe wouldn't trust D-Luck to be my landlord. They're not a department with a long track record of success. But, we have a National Health Service in England, broadly loved as part of what the state provides us with. We don't see housing in that light, and you're right in that it's always kind of localised or privatised. There's always a smaller organisation which you have to go to. Maybe some form of NHS style, let's provide people with housing, is an idea that could work. In terms of the planning and the land, I mean, England has and Britain has loads of land. We use most of it for cows, and that's not a remote exaggeration. It's largely lamb and dairy and beef farming and we should be looking at ways to use some of that for solar panels and wind farms and social housing, as far as I'm concerned, without that simply being an exercise in enriching the people who already own it. I think sometimes people who think that you can just kind of liberalise planning and then the housing crisis goes away tomorrow, and that's not true. But there are just we've built on a tiny percentage of the country, and if we could just turn some cattle fields and some golf courses into beautiful, environmentally friendly social housing estates, and the rest into meadows and the rest into solar panels, I'd be pretty happy. Yeah. What was the final question?
Co-ops.
There's some great housing co-ops. There's some that have worked really, really well, and there's some that still do. They've always been a fringe part of even the fringe part of the social housing sector. But I think it's a model when it's functioning, which gives people ownership and accountability, and it just takes away that relationship of power between a landlord and a tenant, and it takes away the ability to turn that into an asset that's going to make somebody money. And I think it's a great model. If we had a more functional system, it would be much easier to get that rolled out wider. But those things have only ever kind of been in tiny pockets. Like there's a brilliant one that I was speaking to a few months ago. It's a older people's LGBT housing scheme, which has got some land on the banks of the River Thames, not far from the Houses of Parliament, so sort of near Vauxhall. And it's a great scheme. I mean, it only houses about 30 people, but it's fantastic that little kind of niche has been carved out, and they're able to provide people with. In the end, I don't think that many people care whether they're a homeowner or a social housing tenant or a private rented tenant. They care about, do they have long-term security, is their housing affordable, and do they live in a community that they like? And housing cooperatives are a way to provide that for people. I'd love to see more of them.
I'd like to, first of all, just buy these books. They're both extraordinarily dramatic. I mean, I think we haven't quite got to the way in which Peter's book actually is. It's like a horror story, really, because you feel the thump of this terrible event that we all saw happening going. And Vic is about something which we all live in, actually. In a curious way, Grenfell feels over there in a disaster. And Vicky's book is about the disaster that we all live in. So I'd like to thank them very much. I'd like to thank you. And could you all go back to the Bartlett and make sure that they're really doing proper planning teaching? And can you make sure that we have talked nothing about the quality of the building that has been going on, and the dire kind of way in which the private market has not built communities or streets or reinvented towns. So there's a whole other area to this, but the Bartlett is the place where so we've got to go and storm the Bartlett. Thank you very much indeed.